Hey there! This video is going to be all about the dynamic range of the Canon R6 Mark II and how it compares with the Sony A74 and the Canon R7. Now, dynamic range is very important to me as a videographer, and I'm constantly looking for cameras that have the most amount of dynamic range. So in this video, there's some surprising results, some not surprising results, and some things that are really bothering me about all this, so we'll get into all that stuff. All right, so there are a few ways of testing dynamic range, and most of you who are watching this are probably familiar with the tests that people like Cine D and Gerald London do to calculate the number of usable stops of dynamic range. And this is one part of the puzzle, or one part of the equation. I also recommend that you take a look at the image, and I do this in a few different ways, one of which is what's known as a latitude or a push-pull test, where you purposely overexpose or underexpose the image and try to see how much information, detail, and color you can pull out of the extreme parts of the dynamic range and the highlights and the shadows, and also taking a look at some examples. Before we get on to taking a look at the tests, I want to explain how I conducted them so everyone can understand what's going on here. So on the R6 Mark II and the R7, I shot that in C-Log 3, and on the A7IV, I shot that in S-Log 3. Now, the A7IV has an advantage here over the Canon cameras because S-Log 3 has the potential for more dynamic range than C-Log 3, but more on that later. In terms of the codecs, I shot everything in the highest possible quality that I could internally in these cameras. So the R6 Mark II is in 4K IPB, the A74 was in 4K XAVC-SI, and the R7 was in 4K Fine IPB. I also did a custom white balance in each camera. In terms of exposure, I basically used a gray card in zebras. So on the Canon cameras in C-Log 3, you want to set the zebras to 35%. And on the Sony A74 shooting in S-Log 3, you want to set the zebras to 41%. And then I just adjusted the key light to get the right zebras on my gray card, ensuring proper exposure for each camera in the respective log profiles based on the camera manufacturer's recommendations. Now for the overexposure test, I set my exposure at f16, and then I basically open up the aperture of the lens to let in more light to overexpose the image. And when I bring it to the computer, I will correct the exposure for each of those stops of light to try to look and see what's going on in the highlights. And similarly for the underexposure test, I started the exposure at f2.8, and then I stopped down the aperture to let in less light to underexpose the image, and then I raised the exposure in post to see what's going on in the shadows. Now, I corrected all of this by hand. I didn't use any LUTs, but I didn't adjust the colors either. Essentially, I just adjusted the first aperture in terms of getting the contrast and saturation, and then I adjust each clip to match so you can see the changes from each stop in terms of overexposure and underexposure. The first comparison is the R6 Mark II against the A74, and starting out by looking at the overexposure here, you will see that they perform very similarly in the highlights, and they both perform really well. They're good till about 4 stops over, and they start to break at 5 stops. So very similar performance in the highlights. Now, on to the underexposure test. There is a big difference here. The A74 has less noise across the board, and the R6 Mark II gets messy and has a color shift as you dig deeper into the shadows. But the A74 is super impressive here. I'd say it's good down to almost about 4 stops under and holds color really well. It just gets a little bit noisy, but 4 stops under is a long way to go, and there's a clear difference here with the underexposure test and the dynamic range. The A74 does a lot better than the R6 Mark II. The next comparison is the R6 Mark II against the R7, and we'll start out again with the overexposure test. Now, this is very similar results to the R6 Mark II versus the A74. They both perform really well in the highlights, good till about 4 stops over and breaking at 5 stops. So pretty much what we saw in the other comparison. All 3 of these cameras do really well in the highlights. Now onto the underexposure here, and starting out at 2 stops under, they look pretty similar, but again, that R6 Mark II has a color shift as you reach deeper into the shadows, and the R6 II, the noise gets uglier as you get deeper in the shadows and you see more of that color shift. And I think the R7 definitely holds color a lot better than the R6 Mark II. So I know this is kind of weird, but I'm going to have to give a slight edge to the R7 here in terms of the underexposure test and overall dynamic range. It was not what I expected, but I have to say that the R7 performed better than the R6 Mark II in the shadows. All right, so clearly the Sony A74 does a lot better in terms of dynamic range than either of the 2 Canon cameras. And again, this wasn't really surprising because of S-Log 3, but as I said, more on that later. So what are my big takeaways for the Canon cameras? Well, first of all, I wouldn't reach too far into the shadows to try to recover information because as you saw, starting at 2 stops underexposed, the image got pretty messy. So you have to be really careful with your exposure. So if you are shooting in a high dynamic range situation, what I recommend is that you expose as high as possible without clipping the highlights. I made a detailed video about how to expose and color grade C-Log 3 footage without using a LUT, and I will leave that video linked down below if you want to check it out. Next, let's take a look at some examples of a high dynamic range situation. And the example I like to use is me standing in a dark room next to a bright window. And the way I expose for this is I expose for the highlights, making sure I don't clip them, and then I try to see how much information I can recover in the shadows. So please ignore any differences of depth of field between these comparisons. I was using different size sensors and using aperture to control exposure. So taking a look first at the R6 Mark II versus the A7IV, the way that it's easy to see this is if you look at the curtain and also the detail in my face, you'll see that the A7IV shadows have a lot more detail and have significantly less noise. So very clear to see the difference here between the R6 Mark II and the A7IV in terms of dynamic range. Next, take a look at the R6 Mark II against the R7, and this one is definitely a little bit more subtle. But again, look at the curtain in particular. You can see that the R6 Mark II is slightly more noisy, and you definitely see that color shift, which we saw earlier. And if the differences aren't coming through on YouTube, I also saw this in looking at the waveforms as well. So again, the R6 Mark II definitely loses by a little bit to the R7 in terms of dynamic range. But it's really nice to look at an example here and see that it really backs up what we got with the latitude test. So you might be wondering about the 6K RAW capabilities of the Canon R6 Mark II, because the A7IV and the R7 both don't have any way of recording internally or externally RAW video. And so I really wanted to test this out because in general, RAW will give you a little bit more dynamic range than the compressed codecs that you get with C-Log 3. And I've seen this in cameras like the R3, the R5, and the R5C. Now I went to test this and it wouldn't work. I couldn't get it to show an image on my Atomos Ninja V or V Plus because I have both. And so as I said, I wanted to try this out. I couldn't get it to work. I emailed Atomos and they sent me back this response that said, the Ninja V Plus and the Shogun Connect users will be able to record up to 6K 60 in Apple ProRes RAW and up to 6K 30 on the Ninja V with an Atomos firmware update in January 2023. So I can't test it. The firmware doesn't exist until 2023, and as soon as that comes out, I will test this because I'll be curious if you can get a little bit more dynamic range out of the sensor, and I think you will be able to. So this is a big frustration for me, but you know, it is what it is, and sometimes when new cameras come out, there's a little bit of incompatibility with things like raw photos and certain editing software and stuff like that. So we're just gonna have to wait, but again, I will check it out when that firmware comes out. So, as I said earlier, the A74 unsurprisingly has more dynamic range than either of the two Canon cameras because of having S-Log 3 versus C-Log 3. Now, this is kind of gonna be like a mini rant, and I apologize for that, but I think it's really important to talk about this. So, the main thing I wanna talk about is C-Log 2 and C-Log 3. So if you don't know this, C-Log 2 is the log curve from Canon that's the flattest and has the potential for the most dynamic range, similar to S-Log 3 having the most dynamic range for Sony. Now it's a little bit confusing in the Canon world because you have C-Log, C-Log 2, and C-Log 3, with C-Log 2 having the most dynamic range. The reason for the numbering is that C-Log 3 actually came out after C-Log 2, and it was designed to be easier to color grade, which I'd rather have more dynamic range, but either way, that's the difference here. We want to have C-Log 2 that has the most dynamic range. And if you're watching this, you probably are aware of the fact that Canon puts limitations in cameras for various reasons. And so this is probably not a surprise to you, but I think there are kind of two cases that could be happening, either one or the other, or maybe both. The first situation is that they purposely leave out C-Log 2 in their lower end cameras to differentiate between their higher end cameras. The second thing is maybe their sensors can't handle the dynamic range of C-Log 2, and so they don't want to put C-Log 2 in some of these cameras. But the opposite of that is that Sony puts S-Log 3 in all of their cameras, even cameras that definitely could not handle S-Log 3. For example, you shouldn't use S-Log 3 on Sony's 8-bit cameras, you should be using S-Log 2, but they put it in anyways and allow the users to decide what's best for their situation. I really wish they would put C-Log 2 in their a lot more of their cameras, and I think moving forward, I'd like to see Canon start putting C-Log 2 in all of their mid to high-level mirrorless cameras so they can compete with Sony. Maybe we'll see this in the R5 Mark II whenever that comes out, I have no idea, but I think it's important that they're gonna be a little bit more competitive with the mirrorless cameras, and these cameras both cost $2,500. They should perform fairly similarly, but there's a big difference in terms of dynamic range. All right, so the other thing is the raw outputs, and this I think is not really a strong selling point for me because the Sony cameras can also output raw, a lot of them. You have the A7S III, the FX3, even the FX30, which is cheaper, can still output raw video. So it's not like that's a unique feature in the Canon cameras. And I think you can, well, we will be able to hopefully eventually with the R6 Mark II, but in the other cameras, you can record raw video internally like the R3, the R5, the R5C. But it's not a great situation for most people because the file sizes are absolutely huge. And so I think most of us, what we're looking for are normal codecs with C-Log 2 that give you a lot of dynamic range, that are easy to work with and easy to store. Cameras like the C70 have unbelievable dynamic range and shoot in normal size codecs in C-Log 2. So I know it's possible. I'd like to see that happening on more of the hybrid mirrorless cameras from Canon to make them more competitive with Sony. Now, I like Canon and Sony. I own both and use both of them and love them and have enjoyed both systems for a while now. And I think it's important that we help push these manufacturers to increase the capabilities of these cameras, because when the camera companies start competing with each other, we're all going to win. All right, rant over. I just want to see C-Log 2 in the Canon cameras so they have more dynamic range and compete with the Sony cameras. That's all. Overall, I think the R6 Mark II did as expected. The A7IV definitely beats it out in terms of dynamic range, but what I didn't expect was that the R7 had slightly better dynamic range than the R6 Mark II. I didn't see that one coming. But overall, I've been really pleased with the R6 Mark II in terms of the image quality. The colors are awesome, the detail and the sharpness. I really enjoy using it, and I'm gonna keep testing it out and sharing my experiences with all of you. So if you've enjoyed this video and found value in it, please consider hitting subscribe down below. It would mean a whole lot to me. Thank you so much for watching. See you in the next one.